this is clinical trials without clinics, and I will give you a little personal story. So I worked in an FQHC that was 40, 50 miles from Stony Brook University, and I lived very close to the hospital, and it was always amazed that I get these flyers or emails or information about that there were studies going on, would I want to enroll in these studies. But my patients out 40 miles away were not getting this information. So the idea now that I can have access to any study for any patient, regardless of the walls or the proximity of the Medicaid bus, transporting them to that location to have that study, to me is just a great opportunity. So I was curious, what's your feelings about that as well?
Well, not just patients live 40 miles away. What about the 20% of the country that lives in a rural area that have literally no access to clinical trials and really are sort of, to a certain extent, been left behind, in medicine, in the evolution of medicine. I think that's one of the great potentials of clinical trials and AI, is that we can enroll and track and measure and help people that we never were able to even touch before. There's an interesting kind of collaboration that I came across I want to talk about a little bit. It's called the Blue Sky Project. And this is not brand new. It's been around for over a decade, but it was a collaboration between Pfizer and IBM to do clinical trials. And they focused, and I think they're working on a few different things, but one of the early focuses was on dementia, on Alzheimer's. And they worked with IBM to use large language learning models to actually predict dementia years, again we're getting into the before symptoms, but years before there were any symptoms that we could measure in like a standard test. And they did this with changes in voice. So there's changes, and this has been validated, there's changes that happen in your voice way before cognitive changes. And so in this project with Pfizer and IBM, monitoring patients remotely and using AI for voice technology, they've been able to predict dementia much earlier, and now working even on developing therapies that could head it off much earlier. Our dementia therapies are pretty limited. I know we have some certain drugs that are actually super expensive and have moderate treatment effect, but they're way later in sort of the dementia, way downstream when patients have had a lot of symptoms. So I was really, thought this was a great example of how AI can impact clinical trials and things like dementia.
No, that's exciting to hear. Your example of the flyers, having run a number of clinical trials, the recruiting process is so long and so difficult. And it's because it has an inherent degree of inefficiency, because you're sending out a broad area announcement to a group of people where, call it a rare disease, it's going to be 1-2% of the population have it. And then if you think about it, what you want is you want that person at a given point in their disease progression. So it's not anybody that has it, it's they're at this point where your therapy could have influence. So now you take that 1 or 2%, it becomes 0.2%. So that's why a drug costs $1 billion to develop. But part of it is because the clinical trials are so incredibly expensive. And there's been some work in trying to look at using federated learning or swarm technology to say, I'm going to go in and access the electronic medical record while maintaining the privacy, and see if there's the availability of that person, and then figure out if they have the interest in it or want to be enrolled in the trial. But I think there's the opportunity to dramatically improve the efficiency of recruiting patients, and that just decreases the time in a huge way.
Yeah, I know pharmaceutical companies are really interested in this because they know they need to enroll all kinds of different patients. They can't just enroll a certain brand of patients, and the FDA will always challenge them that the findings of a clinical trial aren't translatable to broader populations. So I think now if you bring in wearables and monitoring patients at home, that's a way that you can monitor people. And there's a big problem with clinical trials of patients falling out of the trials, and they just, for multiple different reasons, they don't complete the trials. Yeah. But if you're able to stay connected with them and monitor them, I think that that's much more likely that someone will finish a clinical trial. If there's a much tighter bond, where you're monitoring, you're communicating with them on a regular, maybe even daily basis. So that's one of the things I think AI is going to be very helpful for clinical trials.
And it goes back to your point about owning the disease or the disease owning you. That type of opportunity to be part of that, so let them feel more empowered about them being a part of that disease process and controlling it, I think is very powerful.
Yeah. I know I did see during COVID there were some clinical trials that used wearables and had some success enrolling patients, because there was a time it was really hard to get people to come in for clinical trials, so they would mail them wearable devices and would keep in touch with them via those wearable devices, and it seemed to work.